Hello, and welcome to Shaking and Sipping. This is the show where we shake or stir a cocktail or other mixed drink, have a sip, talk a bit about its history, and some variants thereon. This week, we're continuing our quest to work through the IBA's list of official cocktails to see how those stack up. We're in the Unforgettables category, and this week's Unforgettable is the Sazerac. Now, before we jump into the Sazerac itself, this is Sazerac's rye, made by the Sazerac Company, which is probably a good choice for the drink. I would like to read the blurb on the back of it, though. Maybe it'll give us some tasting notes or something, help us set up where we're going with the episode. This rye whiskey is the perfect choice to make the Sazerac cocktail. America's first cocktail. After recovering from my immediate shock, let's get right into that. This is not America's first cocktail. We're going to have to talk about history quite a bit here, but even if the Sazerac Company's story of the Sazerac were true, and it isn't, that still wouldn't be true. We've talked a bit about cocktail history on the show before in the old-fashioned episode. I gave sort of a brief summary of David Wondrich's piece on the sort of history of cocktaildom from Imbibe. But cocktails were certainly around in the 1830s in America. That is a thing that existed by the 1830s. By Sazerac Company's own tale of where this cocktail came from, the original Sazerac would have been born sometime in the 1850s, maybe the late 1840s. They don't give a date exactly because there's some dates. It's confusing. We'll get into it in a minute. But so that'd be wrong just on its face. There's no chance that the first cocktail in America was a Sazerac in that time period. It's not even in the right area, right? The Sazerac is from New Orleans. Cocktails first came to America via the British influence more so than the French. It doesn't matter. We don't need to get into that. But that'd be wrong. Second of all, if the Sazerac's history of this cocktail is true, the cocktail was originally made with cognac. This is rye. Now, it's true that rye is generally what is used in Sazeracs today, except for by the IBA. However, to put America's first cocktail on your bottle of rye when you yourself as a company claim that it's a cognac drink, that's just baffling. I have no idea what that's about. Alright, speaking of all that cocktail history and thinking about the development of the cocktail, totally unrelated to the Sazerac and in no way foreshadowing anything, I think I'm going to talk a little bit about the cocktails between the initial cocktail and the old-fashioned, and make one of those up for myself to sip as we make everything else. As we discussed in the old-fashioned episode, the initial cocktails, much like an old-fashioned, are essentially bitters, something sweet, and a spirit. Over time, things kept getting added to the cocktail, twists were made, such that eventually that became known as the old-fashioned, because that's the original cocktail, right? Along the way, there were several cocktail trends I think we've mentioned on the show before, like the fancy cocktail, and these are generally called things like a fancy gin cocktail, or a fancy whiskey cocktail, or whatever the spirit is, where the idea is the same. Basically, it's an old-fashioned, but you add curacao to it. That's a fancy cocktail. Eventually that fell out of favor, and by eventually I mean late 1870s into the 1880s, and we started having what are called improved cocktails. And so one of those, of course, would be an improved whiskey cocktail. Here we leave out the curacao, but we're now adding absinthe and maraschino liqueur. So let's mix up an improved whiskey cocktail. All right, so for our improved whiskey cocktail, very simply, in our mixing glass, we're going to have a couple nice dashes of Angostura bitters. We're going to have about a bar spoon of a 2-to-1 simple. I'm using just 2-to-1 white. If you have gum syrup, this would be the ideal place to use it. I don't have any right now. We're going to get about half a bar spoon of maraschino liqueur. And we want just a tiny bit of absinthe. If you have your absinthe in a dasher, one light dash. So I'm just going to do a thumb pour here. That is plenty. And then we want our rye whiskey. This is my beloved Rittenhouse Bonded. I want 2 ounces or 60 milliliters. That's all there is to it. Let's give it a stir. And then strain that into an ideally chilled Nick and Nora or small cocktail glass. And for a garnish, we're just going to grab some lemon. Go ahead and express that over the drink. And I'll just throw that right in there. So this is an improved whiskey cocktail. So, great drink, really simple. Obviously, it mostly tastes of rye, because that's what it is. You do get that little bit of sweetness both out of the simple as well as out of the maraschino. Those really work together to give just that little extra something. The absinthe and the bitters are more in the background, but the absinthe does show up just at the end, a little bit in the throat, kind of grounds everything. The whiskey's just nice and present though throughout. And you need that little bit of citrus twist on top. It really just brightens everything up a ton. All right, so who knows why I made this improved whiskey cocktail? Sure, it won't be relevant. Just gonna set that over here. We can return to that as needed. So for the history of the Sazerac drink itself, I'm gonna not tell it in great detail because it's very long, and as I said, I don't really think most of it's true. There's a guy who owns a place, it's the coffee shop, awesome. They sell other things other than coffee, but it's a coffee house. But then he sells that place to some other guy. The original coffee house guy has a business where they're importing various spirits. One of them is Sazerac, which is a cognac that is popular at that time. He begins selling his spirits to the coffee house guy, which used to be his coffee house. I don't know. And this is sometime pre-war. This is 1840s, I think 1847 or so that he sells it. And this is supposedly where then that coffee house guy created the Sazerac drink using Sazerac cognac. And it's been a beloved treasure ever since. Great. No. So this drink doesn't appear written about for decades after that. There's no indication that this drink was in pre-war New Orleans. There's no indication it was made with cognac and ever called a Sazerac. I'm sure something like this drink was made at some point with cognac, but there's no indication that it was ever called the Sazerac or that had anything to do with the coffee house eventually changing its name to the Sazerac Coffee House or to the drinks being called the Sazerac. Just see no evidence of this whatsoever. In fact, this coffee house eventually changed hands. That was a pun unintended to a man whose surname is Handy. And Handy marketed a variety of drinks, both at his coffee shop as well as bottled and sold eventually nationwide. And these Handy cocktails did not have clever names. They were all called things like gin cocktail, Handy's whiskey cocktail, Handy's brandy cocktail, right? There, not a lot of interest here, but there was a range of them, I believe about 6 of them. And they were fairly popular, but really only one flavor was all that popular, and that was Handy's whiskey cocktail. This is the drink that he also served at the coffee house, which was renamed into the Sazerac. So the Sazerac, supposedly this long cognac drink that's existed for decades, is a renamed version of Handy's whiskey cocktail, whence we make it with rye today. Now, what was Handy's whiskey cocktail made of? Well, there's 2 ways to find out. One is to find an article that was published in 1908, I believe. Yes, 1908, by William Cocktail Booth. And he got the recipe from someone at the company. And so he explains what it is. There's another recipe out there, however. That same source who gave a recipe to cocktail himself at that time, he had a copy of the recipe written down at home. And that recipe is widely believed to be the one that the drinks that were bottled and sold were based on. And his nephew still has that recipe today. So, what is in that recipe? Well, it's rye whiskey, specifically Maryland rye, which isn't really a thing that exists anymore, but it's rye whiskey. It is Peychaud's bitters. It is also Angostura bitters. We'll talk about that in a moment. And it is in an absinthe rinsed glass. And it has a secret ingredient that is not in the other published version of the recipe, maraschino liqueur. So, if we think about that a little bit, wait a second, that's just an improved whiskey cocktail with Peychaud's bitters in it. Indeed. So, the famous Sazerac, the classic of New Orleans, the Sazerac's jewel, is just an improved whiskey cocktail that has a dash of Peychaud's bitters added to it and is built a little bit differently. That's not to knock the cocktail, it's a great drink, and we'll build one in a second. The building style is a little bit different, and certainly Sazerac implies something about the drink. It also is only going to be built with either whiskey or cognac. To order a gin Sazerac wouldn't really make sense. You'd instead say an improved gin cocktail. But that's all it is. There's no magic here. It's an improved whiskey cocktail. And that's a good thing. Alright, so the first thing about a Sazerac is that it's built in a fairly unique way. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take 10 milliliters thereabouts, so that's 1/3 of an ounce, of absinthe. We want real absinthe here. We don't want pastis. I know there are some folks in New Orleans who like absinthe. I'm not one of them. I'm not from New Orleans either, but we're going to pour that into a little tumbler. And we are going to spin that around the glass to wash it. And we are going to pour in some cracked ice. And we are going to set that aside. Then in our mixing glass, we're going to start off with 2 dashes of Peychaud's bitters. I don't think we've used these yet on the show. These are slightly anisette bitters. They're great. They're from New Orleans. They're also from the Sazerac company, or distributed by them at least, so that's an interesting connection. Oh, a 3rd shot. In New Orleans, it's common to make this with 5 or 6 dashes of Peychaud's bitters, depending on the bartender. We're then going to add, according to the IBA, and I really hate this idea, a sugar cube into a glass full of ice. This isn't going to dissolve at all. This is a poor plan. And then finally, because they too believe the Sazerac story, we're going to use cognac. We're going to use 50 milliliters. That is 1 2/3 ounces. It's interesting, we've discussed a bit in episodes how after those first few drinks, the IBA stops giving histories of most of the drinks. This one has a history section, but it doesn't talk about the Sazerac company or the coffee shop or any of that stuff. It just says this drink was originally made with cognac, which switched to rye whiskey after the war. So, okay. All right, we're gonna give this one a good stir to try to break up and dissolve that ice, or that sugar, which we should have muddled first in some water, but that wasn't the instruction. So, I'll see you in a bit. All right, now that this has chilled our glass a bit and given us our absinthe wash, we're going to discard. And we'll strain that into our tumbler. I really like a very simple tumbler for this drink. I don't know why, but I didn't grab my normal ones because I just like this look. we are going to, again, express a lemon. And that is an IBA spec Sazerac. Ooh, a lot of oil in that lemon. Nice drink. So I like it. I don't normally have these with cognac. It is much less spicy than the rye. The main base spirit note is much more warm. It's sort of big, but not aggressive in any way. It's not spicy. It's not hot. It's not strong. It's just big and warm. A little bit of barrel. A little bit of natural sweetness in the cognac. So there's not a ton of sugar, but yeah, that kind of works. No maraschino, but again, I don't know if I need it here. I would probably prefer it with it, but everything just works. This is a nice drink. It's just not, it's not all that big. It's not all that exciting. But reliable sipper this. So how did we get to where we are with the Sazerac? So I think that the story about cognac, that's just because it's a nice old story and this long historical thing, and I'm sure people did build improved brandy cocktails. So it's kind of true, it's just I don't think all that backstory is true and tying in the Sazerac and everything. In terms of why that write-up from 1908 is wrong, I think the maraschino just got forgotten. I don't think anyone meant to leave it out. I think that just got lost in translation someplace. And I think that the Angostura bitters got left out because Sazerac Company sells Peychaud's bitters. Why advertise the competition? So let's try to build something that's a bit the best of both worlds. Let's rely on the actual original recipe as far as we know, and change a few things about the way it's made just to make everything work a little better. So into our mixing glass, which I had to just wash out because there was so much undissolved sugar sticking to everything in there, we're going to go ahead and add some Ango, 2 dashes thereof, and some Peychaud's, 2 dashes there, 3 dashes thereof. Peychaud's doesn't dash, it has voluminously. Then to that, we are going to go ahead and add a bar spoon of simple. The original recipe for this one calls for half a sugar cube, but then does call for it to be muddled in a scant amount of water first before adding to the drink, which just makes sense. We're going to add half a bar spoon of maraschino liqueur, and then we will use the proper Sazerac rye, and we'll bump that back up to its pride of place at 2 ounces, 60 milliliters, thereabouts. The other change I'm making to the original recipe here is they call for you to add the citrus peel here when mixing. I don't like that idea. I want the oils on top, so we're just not going to do that. Let's give it a stir. And then in a show first, although we always talk about how the glasses we serve in would be ideally chilled, I never do that because it's a pain to keep them chilled while I'm recording and running and getting more out of the freezer and stuff. However, welcome to the chilled tumbler. This has been in the freezer for a little while, nice and cold. This lets us avoid that whole frappe process. That's what that's called when you put the crushed ice in the glass and let it hang out for a while first. And then instead of doing the absinthe rinse, which I don't love because you always end up having to dump some out, and then you either have it on the side later or you throw it away, or I don't know. I'm going to go ahead and use an atomizer with some absinthe in it to get a nice coating inside here. It also actually gets us more total absinthe staying in the glass and well covered. So a few spritzes of absinthe, and let us strain. And then we'll stick with our garnish. And that is sort of a hybrid, old-fashioned Sazerac recipe made a little differently. Ooh, so I get more of the absinthe right off the top. It's mingling with the lemon oils really nicely. That's just lovely. So the Sazerac rye is a little bit less proofy than Rittenhouse. So sweetness is coming through a little more, but it's still not a sweet drink at all. You get sweetness right on the tip of your tongue, which is probably the maraschino and the rye as much as it is the sugar, though the sugar's in there. But then right away, as you start going back, you get all the whiskey notes right in the middle of the palate, and then just a hair of absinthe, sort of wide and low, just creeping down the back. Really nice. The bitters, I think the Peychauds are also sort of showing up in the middle of the palate because I get a little bit of an anise thing. And I don't think that's the absinthe. I think that's hitting me later as a separate anise thing. That's just a great drink. I would highly recommend a Sazerac to anyone out there who thinks they might be interested in such a thing. If you don't like sort of an old-fashioned style cocktail, this probably isn't your thing either, to be honest. But if you do like a dry, spirit-on-spirit sort of deal, this is the way to go. Well, thanks so much for coming along with me this week as we looked at the Sazerac, or the improved whiskey cocktail with some extra bitters. As always, we'd appreciate the YouTube things like share, subscribe, comment, tell your friends, tell your neighbors. You can visit the blog at shakingandsipping.com, linked below. We'll have a write-up on this and each other drink. That's also where you can check back most Thursdays to see IBA in real life, where we go and order the drink of the week at a local Seattle cocktail bar, see how they make it, variants, if it's common, etc. You can follow on Twitter at shaking_sipping for updates and Twitter type things, as well as usually a shout out when we do one of those IBA in real life. So we don't do it every week, but it'll be on Twitter when we do. We'll be back next week on this very same channel at this very same time to talk about the next drink on the IBA's list of official cocktails. Until then, happy sipping. Cheers.